But for now, this is what we know when it comes to the origins of probably one of the greatest civilizations in the history of mankind, the Romans. Okay, now, since this is a little bit of a video where we, as you see, try to understand and fully comprehend the origins, in this case, of a people, I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into this when it comes to how we can understand or sometimes extrapolate the origins of something through etymology. Etymology, of course, is the study of the origins of words and the way in which their meanings have changed throughout history. In order to briefly illustrate this point, I would like to now dedicate a small little section to Roman armor, and specifically the lorica hamata, which is how we usually describe, with a modern Latin neologism created by classicists in the modern period, the sort of mail armor, sometimes called chainmail, that the Romans were using. But today, we're going to very briefly touch upon some of the points, particularly with the sources, that have to do with this concept of origins in connection with this type of armor. If we want to know, for instance, where does the lorica hamata come from? What's the origin? Well, first we're going to go and have a look at the history, and it is most likely connected to the 3rd century BC. In fact, the last quarter. The Romans never refer to the lorica hamata as a lorica hamata. This name never appears in the sources, but it is an interesting guess, because even though the word or lorica hamata don't appear, the word hamus does, and it's what the classicists used in order to come up with this name. The word hamus in Latin is translated as hook, maybe even spike, but in this case we're going to look at translation number 1. A hamus is a hook in the sense of something you use for fishing, right? And that's interesting because at the end of the day, particularly when we look at the single rings that constitute, in their multiplicity, a lorica hamata, well, they are kind of like hooks that then are connected with a rivet, oftentimes when it's fully riveted, and sometimes it's half riveted, half solid. The Romans absolutely used the word hamus to describe the component of this armor, so the single rings. Another word that the Romans do use absolutely in the sources to describe what this type of armor is made of is the word catena, for plural catenae, which means literally chain. So even though they didn't call it chainmail, of course, and we never find the word lorica catena, so that doesn't happen, but they do refer to the strips of many rings as catenae, specifically in the context of the description of this armor. And the descriptive aspect of it is really what I wanted to focus on now. The Romans do mention this type of armor, and so do the Greeks, but oftentimes they don't give it a name. They just give us descriptions. They tell us, and they were when the soldiers, for example, of Pompeii were wearing this sort of armor, which was made of many chains, or iron, for instance. Or sometimes they tell us it's made of a multiplicity of hooks. They describe it. So what would they call it? In my opinion, we have two options here. We have the speculative option, and then we have the one based on the actual sources, which, in my opinion, also tells us a lot about the origins of this armor. So the speculative one, or the speculative explanation, is really to say that they just called it armor, because do keep in mind that this was the most common type of armor, the one that was used the longest throughout the Republic in all of its different iterations, all the way up to the Empire, and even during the Empire Principate, even though the lorica segmentata, the segmented one, it starts to be used, of course, and it becomes quite popular as well. Mail never goes out of function or action, it's always used, and then eventually the lorica segmentata, after about 300 years, we believe, will stop being produced, but hamata continues in its later iteration that will become popular during the Dominate, which is the version without the humeralia, so without the shoulder reinforcements, which, as you know, will then continue to be used throughout the Middle Ages as the basis for mail. If it was this common and it was this typical, it's very probable that even though there were other types of armor, that this one was just called armor. And in fact, it is mentioned as thorax. Let me show you. Here it is, thorax. This is a word that we know for a fact was used to refer to it, which just means cuirass. It also means upper body, but cuirass, breastplate, pretty much armor, and they do use it. And last but not least, I want to mention Varro, because he's the one that actually gives it a name in the sources. Once again, I'll give you all of the sources, all of the links on a dedicated video, put everything together. Now we are just chatting. But Varro gives it a name specifically and calls it lorica Gallica. Now, what does that tell you? Well, it connects with that 3rd century BC that I mentioned as we started this section, because the Romans, during that period, in that specific period of time, were fighting against the Gauls, specifically the Gauls of Cisalpine Gaul. And guess what? The type of armor that the Gauls were using was indeed mail. It's just that not every Gaul could wear a mail shirt because it was too expensive, so only their leaders, their nobles, could wear these. It is very likely that they called it Gallica because they copied the enemy's models from the Gauls, and then the difference is that having a strong economic backbone during the Republic, and then of course during the Empire, they took it and gave it to every single soldier, which really made the difference. So this was just to kind of open up with a little bit of a interesting discussion as to how you can deep dive, look at words, look at how certain items of equipment are called, jump into etymology, and perhaps figure out or have a strong indicator as to the, in fact, origins of the thing itself, or as was the main topic of this video, the people. If the origins of armor and all the different types in connection with their words and their meanings, and maybe with a lot of sources, is something that you're interested in, do let me know in the comments below, because I will make a dedicated video. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Now, since today we are talking a lot about the origins of all sorts of things, let me tell you a little bit about the origins and in connection with the word of the weapon called gladius, in connection also with its words. So, to cut a long story short, there are multiple subcategories of gladius, and you're probably familiar with that. We have the Pompeii gladius and Mainz gladius, but one of these is called gladius hispaniensis. Let me show you this word very quickly. There it is, hispaniensis, which means, as it says here, Spanish. Now, of course, Spanish might be a little deceptive in the sense that in this specific time, we're talking about the whole Iberian Peninsula. Now, in the 5th century BC, the Iberian Peninsula was infiltrated by the Celts, in the sense that there was a reasonable relocation of some Celtic tribes, which not only brought their culture, but also their material culture with them, including swords. In this specific time period, the sword that the Celts were using was called the Latin B, which was a type of relatively longish iron sword that was used mostly for slashing motions. But then these people, together with the local smiths, will create a little bit of a hybrid sword between the swords used by the local populations, indigenous populations, and these swords manufactured by the Celts.